Welcome to the Washington Monthly Show. I'm editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly, Paul Glastris. I'm here with my co-host, Ed Kilgore, chief blogger for the Washington Monthly. Ed, how are you?
I'm fine, absolutely fine.
So we
my Georgia Bulldogs won this weekend, so I'm fine.
Well, my St. Louis Cardinals are continuing to stay ahead, but just barely of Pittsburgh, and our nightmare is that they have to face the Cubs in a wild card if Pittsburgh somehow gains on the Cardinals. So a lot of tension in the Glastris house.
Yep.
So today we're going to be talking about politics, international and national, with our good friend Ryan Cooper, national correspondent for The Week, formerly of the Washington Monthly. And if you want to get a great sense of not only sort of the substance behind politics, but behind economics, somebody who really wrestles with the data and tries to throw wrenches in the conventional wisdom, you really ought to be reading Ryan's column at The Week. Ed, before we bring on Ryan, I just want to talk about a couple of things. And the first thing we want to talk internationally a little bit. There's some news we have to factor into our thinking about American politics, but I want to just begin with a little rant against the New York Times, if I may. There's lots to rant about the press, but this is a particular one, and that is the big news out of the week we're coming out of. The big news in policy, in my opinion, or certainly one of the big pieces of news, was the Obama administration's having put out on Saturday, kind of burying a trove of data about American colleges and universities. As you remember, the president had said he wanted to have a federal system of rating colleges. His administration announced that in June that wasn't going to happen. There was really just tremendous pushback from parts of the higher ed community. People kind of thought it was dead. But on Saturday, just an amazing amount of data came out showing things like the average earnings of students at particular colleges and universities. This is the first time the federal government has provided that data, and that's both fantastic and controversial. Fantastic in that we now have an output measure, at least one output measure, of whether a college is worth the price or not, right? Also controversial, and a lot of people don't like the idea, certainly in higher education, of reducing, they say, a college degree to what the income of the graduate is. So we covered this like crazy at the Washington Monthly on our website. Here's my rant at the New York Times. And oh, by the way, so did the bulk of the press. Almost everybody who writes about higher education wrote this as a very big deal. The New York Times covered it as a story about how the administration had failed, how they had promised, the president had promised a rating system, and now we know that he's abandoned that goal. Well, we knew he'd abandoned the goal back when they announced it in June. The news here is this pile of rather controversial data that is going to revolutionize the way magazines like the Washington Monthly rate colleges, and hence the way the market works for colleges. Very audacious thing, and the New York Times sort of covered it as a failure. I just had to get that off my chest, Ed. I don't know if that's something that you share my it's one more fact in the New York Times' in my opinion, failing effort to be an honest arbiter of policy and politics.
Yeah, well, I think we'll get back to the Times coverage of the presidential campaign when Ryan comes on. But yeah, there's some strange stuff going on at the New York Times lately.
There sure is. So that rant done, Ed, we had some news that we need to kind of make sense of. I certainly can't make sense of it because I am no expert on British and Australian politics. But what is the big news in British politics and Australian politics that our audience needs to know about, and what does it mean?
Well, I'm not an expert either, but I do read an awful lot. I have made a couple of apolitical trip to Australia. Let's start with that. The sitting Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, who's often been described as sort of the George W. Bush of Australia, and a guy that's sort of imported American-style social conservatism and combativeness into Australian politics, was dumped by his own party, the Liberal Party, which is actually the party of the right in Australia, basically because polls kept showing that in the next election, his party was going to lose if he stayed on top. And instead, he was defeated by a fellow that earlier was Liberal Party leader, but was considered a little bit too lefty, a little too squishy. He would be considered a arch rhino in the United States. A fellow named Malcolm Turnbull, who's notorious for not only for supporting same-sex marriage, but also pretty robust climate change action. And under Tony Abbott, Australia basically has systematically reversed climate change regulations, which both parties had supported until recently. It's unclear whether Turnbull will be able to turn that back around again, but it certainly indicates that American-style conservatism isn't always catching on everywhere. And on climate change, it could very well be that our Republicans are going to be globally isolated on climate change. Once again, the only real conservative party in the world that just doesn't get it.
Right.
And that's pretty interesting in the long run. In the United Kingdom, the news is that the Labour Party, which recently pretty badly lost a general election, has turned to sort of the ultimate outsider, a fellow named Jeremy Corbyn, as its new leader, in a kind of a peculiar system they have for choosing party leaders, which just was recently renovated. I can't really quite come up with an analog. I mean, to Jeremy Corbyn in the United States, he's a little like Bernie Sanders in that he was sort of half in the party, half out, but was considered pretty much a fringe character. Not only does he favor kind of going back to some of the older labor policies prior to Tony Blair and the New Labor Project, but internationally he's a little uncertain if he wants the United Kingdom to stay in the EU. He's been sort of friendly to Vladimir Putin. He's a big no nukes guy. It's a
anyway. He wants to renationalize.
Big industries.
Big industries like energy and rail, right?
Yeah, and he's also talked about creating a national education service, sort of like their healthcare service. Mm-hmm. But in any event, it's certainly a large and conspicuous backlash against the New Labor Project, which had already sort of run its course after Tony Blair left office, but it's a hard turn to the left, and of course, immediately Americans, being as self-centered as we are, have started wondering if there are lessons for the Democratic Party. Or, in fact, Dan Baltz, great political reporter for the Washington Post, did a piece over the weekend suggesting all these parallels between Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders. And maybe this is part of some sort of global reaction to neoliberalism or globalization, or the sort of the sellout of the traditional left to corporate types like the Clintons and Tony Blair. So I think we're going to hear a lot of that kind of talk in the next week or so. I would point out that the process by which Jeremy Corbyn became Labor leader is very radically different from anything we have here to choose a presidential nominee. I believe about 500,000 people participated in that leadership election in the United Kingdom. Over half of them were people that paid £3 to become affiliate members of the Labour Party and had never been part of the Labour Party before.
Right, and just to clarify, I think that this procedure whereby you could spend £3 and become an affiliate member of the Labour Party was a brand new procedure for this election.
Ed Miliband introduced it, the last leader.
I see. And two was seized on by various unions in the UK and got their members to buck up the £3 and in a sense stuff the ballot for Corbyn, which is all fair and right. No reason you can't do that. But it's sort of worth noting that his success was based on a kind of a new electoral procedure that the left exploited very, very cleverly.
Well, he was the only leadership candidate who said positive things about the change. The other candidates were sort of, no, I don't really want these people supporting me, the £3 people. And, so he had a big advantage there. He had a lot of enthusiasm, which you might expect, given the, sort of the condition of the Labor Party right now. And, but analogizing that to our system for nominating a presidential candidate is just crazy. I mean, there's nothing, millions and millions of people will participate in the Democratic nominating contest. It takes months and months and months. It hasn't even really begun yet, obviously. There's just no way you can say that because Jeremy Corbyn won there, Bernie Sanders is or isn't going to win here. It's a completely different system. Having said all that, obviously it's pretty much time to say that the era of center-left modernizing parties, which prevailed not just in the United States under Clinton and the United Kingdom under Blair, but really in almost every advanced democracy in the world. You had something like the New Democrat movement, the New Labor movement, some sort of effort to adjust old party orthodoxies, the need to win middle-class voters in an election. It has sort of run its course.
I would say that in the United States, I think that a lot of progressives who did or would have supported that sort of new democratic philosophy kind of saw this coming a while ago. The DLC closed its doors a few years ago, and though I think Barack Obama ran a presidency more or less in line with a lot of Bill Clinton's, not only his people but his policies. I don't think he was such a sharp break with Clintonism as most people expected. In some ways, yes, some ways, no. I think that it's sort of the United States. The progressives in the United States are a little bit ahead of maybe the center left in the UK, and I think Paul Krugman had a nice column on that, pointing out that what you had, one of the contributing factors to the success of Corbyn and his faction in Labour in the UK was the utter collapse of sensibility among the moderate Labour officials when it came to issues of spending and debt. What we had in the United States in the wake of the collapse of the financial system was a kind of unity among Democrats that we needed to stimulate the economy with more spending, a kind of understanding within the highest reaches of the White House that we had a Keynesian problem in need of a Keynesian spending solution. They didn't get nearly what they may not have asked for as much as they should have, and they didn't get all that they wanted, but that was the basic instinct. And, we've had this sort of colossal battle over deficits and spending ever since, but it's very clear the Democrats are for more spending and worry somewhat less about the deficits. Republicans, the opposite. In the UK, the Tony Blair Labourites utterly, so Krugman says, accepted the conservative view that, we spent too much money. That was part of the reason that the economy's in the tailspin. I guess we have to have some austerity. I'm not sure Krugman's exactly right about that. But anyway, the only point I think we need to take away from this is that, it's a different era. We may not need the kind of reform movement that the New Democrats and New Labor represented
But the question is, do these parties need to be systematically purged of the kind of people that supported that in the past? That's sort of what Corbyn stands for in the UK. Let's get rid of these Blairites and go back to the way it was before, start over. And, I think the question about Hillary Clinton is she's trying to sort of carry out a post-New Democratic unity campaign that kind of draws on the best traditions of the whole party. I think that's the way she would spin it, whereas Bernie Sanders represents a pretty significant change in where the Democratic Party would be going. And the question is that what Democrats want, and is that what can prevail in what's probably going to be a pretty close presidential election?
Well, I think it's a good segue to bring on Ryan Cooper here. Ryan, welcome to the Washington Monthly Show.
Thanks for having me.
So Ryan, you've been writing a lot about Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, the potential for a Bernie Sanders come from behind success in these primaries. I think if you combine the fact that Bernie Sanders clearly has made himself into a significant liberal left insurgent with movement behind him, the big crowds and all that, and the decline of Hillary Clinton's poll ratings, though from a very high base, it seems to me that we have to think that the next question on the minds of people who aren't necessarily staunch Bernie supporters or staunch Hillary supporters, and there's plenty of both, is which of these two candidates is going to make the best general election candidate? Because, we now have a real race, I think. How do you think voters are going to thread that needle or make that distinction, that decision, and how do you make that decision?
Well, I have various thoughts. I should preface this by saying that this election has caused me to undermine my own confidence in kind of, my sense of the electorate probably more than any time in my lifetime with the rise of Trump and Carson, which I never would have predicted. And even the success that Sanders has had is way out of whack with what I would have thought, 6 months ago. So I wrote on this, and my argument was that Hillary and Bernie would be probably about sixes in terms of a general election, because their pluses and minuses would basically balance out. You have Bernie has the enthusiasm, but he's also, rightly considered quite a bit more left-wing than Hillary. Hillary has the money and the elite support, but she's got, the media has this kind of persecution of her and her, whole political organization. And she's not, clearly not developing the same kind of enthusiasm that Bernie is. A lot of political science people came at me on Twitter saying, well, when people are considered extreme, there's all this complicated evidence to suggest that they do pay an electoral price. And, that other things equal, that seems pretty convincing that it would be kind of another mark against Bernie in a general election. But I think that the wild card in that would be, how Bernie is perceived if he were to lock down the nomination. How would he be portrayed in the media and amongst the Democratic elite? Would there be a big sort of exodus of the money class away from the Democrats if he were to run, saying, we got to have 70% top marginal tax rate? And two, who would the Republicans nominate? Because if they nominate Trump, which I don't think we can rule out, then you have two people who are, would probably both be portrayed as kind of equally extreme, and probably Bernie would be considered more moderate, and if that were the case, amongst the centrist, the big media heavies and so forth. So I still kind of think, given the fact that Trump and Carson are now at 56% combined support among the Republican primary voters, according to the most recent polls, and the various other factors. I think Bernie would be maybe a slightly weaker candidate, but not really that much. It definitely would not be a guaranteed loss. I would still give him like a very good chance, were he to lock down the nomination, which I still think is pretty unlikely.
Ed, does that sound right to you?
For the most part, I would start with the premise that we're in an era of polarization in which you have to generally assume that any general election candidate, however extreme, crazy, whatever you want to call them, are going to start with about 45% of the vote. The percentage of the electorate that's really up for grabs has been declining pretty steadily for quite some time. So I think the assumption that Donald Trump, if he were to get the nomination, or Bernie Sanders is non-electable is pretty dubious. It doesn't take that much to get from 45% to 50%. And if you're running against somebody, as Ryan points out, who's also considered extreme, it's a whole new calculation. In terms of the mechanics of putting together a majority, the conventional wisdom all along has been that Hillary, if she's probably the best positioned Democrat of anybody you could name to sort of bring the Obama coalition back to the polls, minority voters, perhaps younger voters, and could maybe top that up a little bit or offset any losses she has with an extraordinarily high percentage of women, white women. Bernie, I think the claim you're going to hear in terms of Bernie Sanders is that his X factor is that he can better compete for that white working class vote that Democrats have really struggled with in recent presidential elections, and that happens also to be sort of Donald Trump's base. I think both of those are plausible arguments for electability. What really still daunts me, Ryan's not old enough to remember the McGovern campaign of 1972, but he does mention the possibility that the media label of extremist could be attached to Bernie Sanders, and that could really damage him. I think that's probably true. I think he could get sort of in connection also with his age, which nobody's really focused that much about. The man's well into his 70s. I think you could see sort of a sustained media treatment of Bernie Sanders is old, out of touch, from another era, kind of treatment that really could hurt him. And I don't know how you factor that in at this point. But I think, to be fair, at this, and I'm with Ryan on this too, this is a presidential cycle that's upending a whole lot of conventional wisdom already. But I think the electability arguments in both parties are going to be pretty interesting between now and the time people actually start voting. You do have to start with these head-to-head trial heat polls, bad as they are this early. And, so far, Bernie's not doing really any worse than Hillary in most of them.
Which gets to the point that Ryan, both you and Ryan are making, is that when you can count on the bulk of Democrats coming home to whomever is nominated, then
right.
You really are playing against a couple of forces. One, where would those small handful of true independents likely want to go? Two, what's the candidate on the other side? And then three, the thing that you both mentioned, which is the press issue. And just to sort of expand that, Ed, people sort of are aware that Hillary Clinton has a problem with the press. I think it's now gotten to the point where, you have to really do somersaults to explain away the press's hatred of the Clintons in various ways. We had Julie Mason on the program last week, and she was pointing out the press is part of the reason the press is angry at Hillary Clinton is she edged out the Kirsten Gillibrands and others who might have made the race more interesting for the reporters. And it's now more boring than they would like, and they blame that on the Clintons. So this thing goes very deep. We have yet another, sorry to beat on the New York Times, but we have another example recently of Hillary's, the New York Times handling of Hillary. On Saturday of this past weekend, Ed, the New York Times had on its front page piece by Maggie Haberman that was a TikTok of the way Hillary made it to the position of the decision to apologize for her emails. I know you wrote about that.
I just thought it was the most blatantly biased thing I'd seen in a while. It's a story about a story about a story, you know, and it's their coverage is now developed. The Times coverage of Hillary Clinton's email scandal is really approaching the
Baroque.
Well, I was going to say kind of self-validating claims that just build on each other. Once you establish, the hypothesis that this is something that should bring down a presidential candidate, might bring down a presidential candidate, you're putting it on the front page. Your columnists are going after it. Pretty soon, the whole organization becomes rather invested in it. And, and frankly, people like us that are sniping at them will probably make them dig in even more. It's a big, complicated election. There's a lot more to the media than the New York Times, but it certainly is strange to watch a newspaper of record go after a presidential candidate sort of in the same way that Fox was going after Donald Trump in that first debate. It's just, frankly, kind of unseemly. I'm not much of a traditionalist when it comes to media, but this can't be good.
Well, I would add to that in the same Saturday paper that piece about the sort of TikTok about Hillary's apology over her emails appeared. On page A14, the New York Times ran a story that had actually been broken by the Washington Times 3 days earlier, that the Justice Department essentially concluded that Hillary Clinton had all the power she needed to erase those emails, whether they were on a private email system or a government email system. So that basically validates at least part of what she's been saying all along, that she's got nothing to apologize for at least in terms of having broken any rule or anything.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Ryan something, because he's been paying close attention to the whole, Clinton-Sanders rivalry. Isn't it kind of strange? Most Sanders fans that I know of are just dying to take down Hillary Clinton, but they're being very, very careful not to pile on to this sort of media Republican assault on Hillary for this and that scandal. They seem to want to win on the merits, on substance. Is that, imagine that. Is that what you're hearing from Sanders fans? I mean, are they privately cheering on this sort of, sustained effort to go after Hillary Clinton on non-substantive matters?
No, I don't think so. I think there's two things that Sanders people are, as you say, not big fans of Hillary in general, but
no.
I think that they like that he's running his campaign on bringing out the things that he cares about, and he has notably refused several baits to go after Hillary in interviews and stuff like that, just saying that's not how I'm going to run my campaign. But the other thing that I think is maybe the bigger factor is that it's become like Benghazi, which is just a punchline on left-wing activists these days. It's like the constant drumbeat of all these like long stories that don't have really any point to them, and it's really vague about what the supposed offense is. And if you dig into it, it's like, a couple of minor mistakes here and there maybe, but really nothing big, and in general, overlooking the entire trajectory of her career as Secretary of State. What is that even about? Well, they're not going to tell us. And I think that, the left wingers are just rolling their eyes at this point. It's just this is such a ridiculous, treatment.
Well, that sounds right to me, Ryan. And I wonder, getting back to a point the two of you were making before, we sort of know what buzzsaw of press sort of narrative Hillary Clinton is running into and probably will continue to run into. Bernie Sanders will have his, fairly or unfairly. The main one being, as you all said, left-wing socialist extremist. Does the left base of the party that is supporting Bernie Sanders factor that into their thinking?
Not really. I think that, among left-wing activists, there's just no real trust of the mainstream press, I would say. And so they're just looking at this right now as a challenge to Clinton, as this kind of entrenched dynasty politician, and the kind of, the fact that Sanders has done as well as he has, is kind of almost unbelievable, you might say. And the fact that he could potentially win, I think, hasn't sunk in really at all amongst, many of his supporters. And they almost don't really dare to believe it. And so I think that folks haven't quite come to grips with that, sort of scenario, because particularly I would say because, if people resent for a long time, saying, once the nomination process is concluded, then, you are, morally obligated to support the Democratic nominee because the Republican's so much worse. And a lot of left-wingers really hate that kind of reasoning because, it implies that you'd never really get a shot. But now that, the shoe might be on the other foot in that respect, I think that they're going to have to start thinking seriously about that, because it really does matter. Tactical voting is, you can't ignore it. And so, it's interesting to watch people who are, I imagine that the situation with Corbyn supporters was somewhat like that it was wow, this outsider who's just been on the fringes of politics for so long suddenly is at the center. And it's whoa, what, now we actually have to take responsibility for stuff instead of just pointing out things that are wrong. That's a new sensation.
Well, before we get too excited here, I think we should point out that, so far, despite his rapidly improving position in New Hampshire and Iowa, he's now leading Hillary in every poll taken in New Hampshire, I think, for a couple of months now, and has moved ahead in Iowa in a bunch of polls. He's still not showing any kind of breakthrough in the rest of the country, where minority voters are a plurality or a majority of the Democratic primary vote. I think we just saw our first real poll from South Carolina over the weekend. He's not doing very well there because he's getting absolutely waxed by Hillary Clinton among African Americans, which you might expect. So whereas I think we do have to seriously consider the possibility that Bernie's going to win the nomination. He's not there yet. Even if he wins Iowa and New Hampshire, he's not there yet. And then there's this whole weird Biden factor. I mean, part of the reason Hillary's losing steam or losing points in these polls is that they're systematically testing Joe Biden in every one of them. He's now up into the 20s in a lot of polls. I personally, if I had a farm, I would probably bet it that Joe Biden is not going to run for president of the United States. So if and when he finally pulls out, I have a feeling that's going to change the whole dynamics of the race. For all I know, it'll give Bernie an even bigger boost. I mean, some of these polls we're seeing do ask people that if Biden's not in the race, who would you support? And Bernie's lead over Hillary actually increases in that circumstance. But, it would definitely change the dynamics of the race in a way that might wind up helping Hillary. I don't know. What do you think about this whole Biden factor, Ryan? Am I just howling in the wilderness?
Yeah. No, I don't think so. He doesn't. His heart doesn't seem in it. His record, when you look back on it, is not well suited to the current moment among political or liberals and leftists. He was big into the war on crime.
Well, he was also the sort of the chief defender of the credit card industry during the bankruptcy reform debate that sort of launched Elizabeth Warren's political career. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead.
It seems like I look at Joe Biden and say, who does he take votes from? And I'm a little surprised, Ed, to hear you say that there are polls showing that maybe he's taken them from Bernie, because to me,
doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense at all. He is as establishment as Hillary Clinton. He has easily as compromised by his home state favor doing for the credit card industry as Hillary is for the banks. Both he and Hillary have been said to have as their advantage a capacity to get white working class votes. Both of them have staunch, deep, long-standing national security credentials. And one might paint Joe Biden as slightly more less hawkish than Hillary Clinton, but Hillary Clinton advised that Barack Obama send in the special forces to get Osama bin Laden Obama bad, and Joe Biden, as if memory serves, argued the opposite. So I'm not sure he beats her on national security anyway. To me, a Joe Biden Hillary Clinton contest is the most likely scenario that hands Bernie Sanders the nomination, because you'd basically be splitting the establishment vote. That's how I would think.
One would think, but that's absolutely not what the polls are showing.
Yeah, I could be having it completely wrong.
But I guess I assume that some of the press mania the media want to draft Biden. They're trying very hard to do it themselves. And you have to assume some of that is just, another horse race factor, more excitement. Some of it's they don't like Hillary.
Yeah. Well, Stephen Colbert begged him to run last week on his show. It was an astonishing thing. Let me, in the last segment here, the last few minutes of our show, get you guys to talk a little bit about the Republicans. We've really focused on the Democrats for the most part. We have now yet more poll data showing the continued success of Donald Trump. We're about to have a debate at the Ronald Reagan Library, hosted by CNN. Ryan, I'm interested in some of your thoughts that you've written in your post, in your column, about what you think Donald Trump represents for the Republicans. I think it overlaps with some things Ed's been writing too, but I want to hear it from you, and I want to get your sense of how much of that might come out in this next debate.
So my the way I've been making sense of Trump, I should say, is that he represents something similar to the National Front in France, which is to say a party that runs very, very hard right on immigration and social issues, and really plays into the kind of grievance politics amongst like conservative whites, that they like somebody who's just kind of a bully, who never apologizes, never backs down from anything, and sort of like puts himself out there as a strong man, kind of like a Mobutu or something. And that's
a comparison I haven't heard before.
Yeah, and so he I think he's discovered that not only that people like that a certain fraction of the Republican primary base is just addicted to that kind of personality and they just love it. Also, they don't really care that much about the Republican elites, favorite things, which are tax cuts for the rich, and abolishing Social Security and Medicare and the rest of the Great Society, and winding back the clock to the New Deal. It's like a lot of Republican primary voters are old people on, a lot of government benefits. And, previously people have tried to thread that needle by saying, we're not going to cut anything for people who are over 55. But what Trump shows is that a lot of people just don't care about that at all. You can run sort of center-left, say, we're not going to really do anything to Medicare, Social Security. That's fine. We're gonna stick it to the Mexicans, and that's when people are stomping the floor, as George Wallace used to say.
And also the thing that seems to resonate that you pointed out in one of your posts is the sort of sense of cultural isolation and hatred of liberal elites pushing their fancy new ideas about gay marriage and so forth down their throats.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of the meat of grievance politics. It used to be, I think, Republican sort of cultural politics was the war on crime, and then you could have your sublimated racism in there and stuff too. But
that's coming back too. That's coming back too.
Yeah, to some degree, though the crime wave seems largely illusory, but I mean it's definitely part of it. But anyways, aside, the march of kind of social liberalism has been just unstoppable. I mean, as you see in Britain and Australia, the right wing party now has just given up completely on that kind of stuff. And so there's this, section of people that are just fuming that this has happened. I think people really hate being, labeled by the, cultural mainstream as bigots.
Right.
And 4 years ago, the whole Republican platform was that gay marriage was evil and an abomination and all that kind of stuff. And now, from 2004 to 2014, the tide has completely turned, and now they're on the receiving end of a cultural rout, and it really sucks. They're really, really ticked off about it.
Yeah, and I think the point to be made here, and I think you put your finger on it in your piece, was it's not necessarily that they are anti-gay marriage or want to see. This is not necessarily a Christian conservative demand that Republicans roll back gay marriage. It's don't label me a bigot for not being for gay marriage. Don't label me a retrograde for making talking about the chicks or the gals or having attitudes which I didn't think I ever had to apologize for 10, 20 years ago about gender and so forth. And this sense that people who were once comfortable in their culture are now rendered uncomfortable in their culture. I think Donald Trump speaks to those folks.
Yeah, exactly.
Who would have predicted that the most popular buzzword in Republican politics in a presidential year or buzz term would become political correctness? Ben Carson, who, as you know, in some ways has better numbers than Trump, certainly in terms of favorability. I mean, it's every other breath he takes, he's denouncing political correctness. And Trump talks a lot about it too. And he obviously exemplifies a politically incorrect attitude. And just the other day, Bobby Jindal, who went after Donald Trump, hammer and tongs, said the good thing about Trumpism, which he still champions without Trump, is that it'll be a politically incorrect conservative revolution. So this idea that conservative voters are furious at being labeled politically incorrect really is a pretty big deal. Or these guys wouldn't be talking about it so incessantly. It's amazing that a presidential nominating contest with this many candidates would turn on something crazy like this, but I think it's kind of hard to avoid, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean it's clearly the meat and potatoes of Republican political culture nowadays, and it is from the other side it is pretty astonishing how fast the gay marriage swing was in public opinion, and similarly I think for like marijuana legalization, went from like -20 to +20 in the space of about 10 years. Interracial marriage, if I remember correctly, that was a much slower and more consistent kind of swing, though, the result was the same. I think the speed is part of what's driving people's sensitiveness to this.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now, so just to close out, I want to ask you both to kind of make a prediction. In this next debate and debates that follow, are we going to see the securing of this sort of outsider political correctness driven immigrants be damned white nationalism in the Republican Party, or are these debates going to begin to turn that around and turn issues back toward the issues that the establishment Republicans would like to be talking about, from tax reform to entitlement cuts and so forth?
Well, I think what we're not going to see in this debate, I assume, is what happened in the first one, which is the moderators, either on instructions or their own volition, turned the debate into a sustained attack on Donald Trump. I mean, that's what I carried away from the debate at the time. It was all about Trump. It didn't work. It backfired, if anything. And so I don't think we're going to see that again. I guess my prediction is that if current trajectory continues for a while longer, there's going to be a mammoth panic among establishment Republicans, and probably an effort to consolidate behind one of the candidates they consider preferable. I'm not even sure who it will be. Could be Marco Rubio, could be Jeb Bush, or could be John Kasich for all I know. But I think the panic on the Republican side is going to grow palpable if we get through this next debate and Trump's still riding high.
Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, I would I would put very little certainty behind this prediction, but I would imagine that what you'll see is an attempt by the establishment people to co-opt the Trump ethos into the kind of policy platform embodied by Jeb Bush's recent tax plan, which is just like his brother's was. And so I think that you will see a consolidation of, right-wing, anti-immigrant sort of rhetoric, but they're going to try to channel it. That's my prediction. And, I will not be surprised if it's not how it works out. But.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what you're going to see in these debates is a firm attempt by a lot of the moderators and certainly the candidates to get back to meat and potatoes, establishment Republican issues. And my guess is that it's not going to work. So that's my prediction. We've got your guys. And so I want to say thank you to Ryan Cooper of The Week magazine, and Ed Kilgore, blogger for the Washington Monthly magazine. Interesting discussion. Ryan, hope you'll come join us again. Always great to have you.
Thank you.
Ed, we'll talk to you next week.
Absolutely.
Goodbye now.